some of you will be artists, some of you will be therapists, and what's so wonderful about this topic is that it really is about the beginnings of creativity that start with the placenta. And so I'm just going to say that it's a fantastic pleasure to welcome to the salon today the absolutely wonderful mind and spirit and beauty that is Siri Hustvedt.
My goodness.
I know. But you don't even blush. You don't even bat.
No, I think I am a little red over here. Anyway,
So,
thank you, Anna. Thank you.
and Siri's, as well as being a wonderful novelist, she also is a very brilliant essayist, and she's written on psychoanalysis, art, motherhood, and actually her work has illuminated some of my thinking about violent women, and in a very wonderful essay in Mothers, Fathers, and Others. But here today, we're really going to focus on the placenta, this notion of the beginnings, the embodied fusion, or the two separate but also interconnected beings through the placenta, and what the meaning of that is, what it does in terms of create this third space, and how these, what Siri calls umbilical phantoms, can be found and seen and reveal themselves in later life and in art. So thank you so much for joining today. And I'm just going to start by just throwing some questions out to Siri and hearing her. And as I say, if any of you would like to join at any point, just like either do your little hand icon or raise your hand, or in the traditional way of my family, just interrupt. Just, I have something really important to say. No, 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 me. So my first question really is, so Siri starts this wonderful paper, which if you haven't already received it, I wanted to check with Siri that we could send it to you, because it's cool. It's just brilliant. It's deceptively short, but it's just jam-packed with just the most wonderful ideas. And Siri opens with this wonderful phrase about the between spaces. Psychoanalytic healing and art making are born in the in-between, a mix of here and there, me and you, dreams and waking reality, inside and outside, feeling and symbol. And the roots of this reality predate this thinking subject, but live on in the rhythms of our bodies, in relation to our bodies, other bodies, and the world. I may have added something there. Siri, can you say something about that? Incredible.
Yeah, I think in a way, the story of the West, and I wish I was much more literate about other stories, actually, but most of my work has been focused on the story of the West. In other words, my own intellectual heritage, and maybe especially since the 17th century, but you can date a lot of these ideas back to the Greeks. This, this idea of the between, or a mixed reality between entities, is something that has, I think, been lost in amnesia, which is not to say, I mean, psychoanalysis, the idea of transference, which is, of course, moving throughout this whole paper, is precisely, about that. So I'm not arguing. I mention a lot of thinkers that have talked about relationality, including Martin Buber, of course, I, thou, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Suzanne Langer, who's a philosopher that interests me a lot. So it's not that it doesn't exist, but rather that, especially the way I think Western science has proceeded, is by creating very fixed and often static categories that ignore relationality in the between.
So that's a really interesting idea. They're just looking at binaries.
Yeah, at binaries, and if you, I mean, there was a moment in my life when I was, I have read a lot of neuroscience, got very interested in the brain. And actually after, well, maybe a decade or so of working on that, I was sent back to the 17th century mind-body problem discussions because I realized that much of neuroscience had adopted an essentially Cartesian view of the human being, the human subject, and that it had, gone off the rails because of that, with theories like computational theory of mind, et cetera, et cetera. So going back to the 17th century, start to think about this idea of the body as a machine, with parts that if you take it's an idea of biology which I think is fundamentally in error, right? That if you take us apart and put us back together, you will get a whole, right? So there are theories that are opposed to this, and I happen to be one of those people who thinks that biology is dynamic, not static, that, the general philosophy of Western science has lost that dynamism in a series of taxonomies that can mislead us. Now, the placenta business is absolutely fascinating because
Yeah.
the Western medicine, until very recently, there's something now called the Placenta Project that was started in 2014. The first conference that I was able to find on the placenta as an organ was in the UK in 1978, and
Wow.
it was called Placenta, the Forgotten Experimental Animal.
Oh, gosh.
I read everything, and it took me years to understand what was going on. And I now have traced it back to the Plato's idea of the uterus that comes from before Plato as an animal. So this reference, which was not explained in the conference, is clearly a Platonic reference, which I didn't understand when I was reading it. But the placenta has been missing from medical discourse, except, of course, if you look at folk, medicine,
Mhm.
obviously before, the 19th century, which is when childbirth became truly medicalized. Then the placenta has a real role in, of course, childbirth because it's the afterbirth. So
Yeah.
earlier writers that the placenta is definitely present in childbirth narratives that predate that. Then it's like it's amnesia. Now, so my point about the phantoms, of course, is identifying specific writers that I care about, thinkers, including Freud with his grandson, the wonderful Fulda story of the toy and the string, and Winnicott, who I love as a thinker, but they all do not recognize that these are phantoms of an umbilical connection. They never say it.
And do you think that that's because there's a male fear of dependence or a kind of unconscious envy of the
Well,
procreative
I
power of the
can't help feeling
mother?
that someone like D.W. Winnicott, if he had realized it, would have jumped on it.
Yeah, because you
I mean,
describe the placenta as akin to his kind of the transitional space, in which,
absolutely. And even more literal is the image of the umbilical cord that we all recognize. We all have navels after all. It's part of who we are. But I think again the tradition and the taxonomies of Western science and medicine made this organ kind of vanish. And because we have a literal biological organ of connectivity and separation, which is what the placenta is, right? And that it doesn't really start functioning until the second trimester. So the first trimester, the embryo and the placenta is growing and developing, but it's really fed directly from the blood of the mother. And if you look at embryology papers, you will see that, this is known. I mean, how did I find out? Well, I read, but they don't really know how to, I think, frame this kind of mixing, right? Mixing is a very difficult concept for Western science and medicine.
So there's a real almost safety in the dichotomy, in the sense
Yeah, I think in the boundary, right?
Yeah.
So what you said about dependence, I think is true. And again, if you look at, research on, the developing embryo and fetus, there's a huge stress on, like I talk in the paper about the astronaut
Yes, I
metaphor.
love that
That
metaphor.
really, I mean, there's a wonderful book by Barbara Duden, the German historian. And she, I cite her in the paper because she's the one who dates this from the images. What's his first name? His last name is Nilsson, that were in Life magazine. They were actually images of aborted fetuses, but of course that wasn't mentioned. And it was because the the maternal body is completely missing. It's like this little growing astronaut, who has no real connection to another body. And that also, because of sonograms, has become part of the idea that what we're looking at is not this complex tripartite system, right, of the maternal, the fetal, and the placental, but just this like autonomous little growing astronaut, right?
Yeah,
And
well, actually,
sonograms feed that, right? Because, and listen, I just became a grandmother on January 1st, and my daughter and son-in-law sent me images, sonogram images of that are so clear now of, the squashed face of my now 3-month-old little Miles Ostrander. And it was, when I was pregnant many years ago, 36 years ago, I did not have clear images like that, just one sonogram at 12 weeks, and it was pretty fuzzy. So I think this is part of a cultural drama of excising the maternal.
I mean, it's really interesting what you're saying, because my mother wrote about the mother goddess and this mythical mother goddess, but actually what there were, and it was a Jungian idea, but she found that there were in many different cultures lots of goddesses of the placenta, goddesses of fertility, goddesses of
Yeah,
childbirth, goddesses for babies development, and then it just all got kind of wiped out, and this wiping out of this incredible organ just seems to mirror that. And
yeah,
I was wondering, actually, and it's open to other people too, to think about what are the kind of unconscious or conscious images of the placenta and
yes,
fetus that develops. So for some of the, I guess, the most disturbed women I've worked with, and I work with women who have these horrible, disturbed, traumatic experiences, which some people could argue have started in intrauterine and continue when they're born. Some women who are born to drug addicted mothers or
Yeah.
have violent partners, who mothers have violent partners, so their birth might be premature, they might
Yeah.
be born with all kinds of, and then when they become pregnant, there's this fantasy that they're going to be whole and they're going to be cared for and loved. And in fact, they can perceive that they don't feel that there's this organ inside them which houses this other being, which is both them and not them. They feel like there's this alien invader. And
Yeah.
you describe that as being actually quite a medical model, this notion of a kind of
Yeah.
space in which
It's
an
yeah.
alien lands rather
Yes.
than.
Yes. And there's the sort of neo-Darwinist, which I'm going to use the word, and because I think it is the neo-Darwinist fantasy. And in the notes, there's a lot in the notes, as Anna was saying, this is like, in some ways, I hope it's very clear, but at the same time, there's a lot of research that's kind of just, I stuck in the notes because I knew it was for psychoanalysts, not biologists, for example. And so there's a lot of that stuff, but this alien invader is, has often been a model for pregnancy. So because obviously there's genetic material from the father, the idea then is that the immune system is supposed to reject the embryo and fetus. And then the big question has been, why doesn't it do that? Now, my question is doubling into the question, which is, why are they asking that question when we know that childbirth is, is guaranteeing the survival of the species? And, most of the time this doesn't, go wrong. So why ask the question about rejection? Well, the question about rejection is already predicated on these taxonomies of, self and other. And the best work that's being done now on the immune system is by people who are questioning this invader self-other distinction. And there are many reasons to question that. One is that, of course, we are not made of single DNA, right? We also have a microbiome. So we're all inhabited by others. Women who have been pregnant have the cells of their fetuses in them, which is called microchimerism, which I mentioned briefly. We are a kind of plurality, genetically, and in all kinds of ways. And, that we forget that we really are made of two people who
Yeah.
mixed. That is what reproduction is. And somehow Western science has managed to jump over this and then have all these invader metaphors, warlike metaphors, for a natural process that guarantees the survival of the species. I mean, that's why I'm
Yeah.
asking these questions. I do not think, by the way, that anything I've said has set the world on fire, but I know for a fact that nobody else has said it, right?
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
I think it's time, that this got picked up on. I do know, I actually have a friend who's a philosopher and neuroscientist who's gotten very interested in pregnancy. And if you look around, you'll see that the philosophy of pregnancy is also becoming of much greater interest. There was really no philosophy of pregnancy. You can count the philosophers. Now, Aristotle was interested in the placenta, and he was interested in, gestation. There's, a theory that he may actually have even talked to midwives.
Oh,
Because,
really?
yeah,
Well,
and
that's.
of course, Aristotle, he's got his ups and downs, as we know, women as slaves were inferior. that's how he organized everything. He actually makes Plato look a little better in that regard. But I think my mention of the Aristophanes story from the symposium is, again, nobody that I can find, no classicist, nobody who's written about the symposium has ever linked this to actual real birth.
Can you say a bit more about that for people who may not?
Yeah, so this is, there's many people know this story because, it's a kind of mythical story about the origin of human beings, and that, in the beginning, there were, people with 4 arms and 2 heads and everything, and then they were cut in half. Zeus, ordered punishment, and that they were cut in half, and that's why, erotic desire and love for the other is explained. But when you look at the passage, which I, have read the symposium a few times, is that where the cut happens, it's tied up at the navel. This is clearly a reference. I mean, I don't, then I was talking to someone who asked me, so Siri, do you think Plato knew? I don't think he necessarily knew, right? This is maybe just an unconscious thing, but I do think we have to recognize it as a reference to actual natural birth. Because what is it, after all, as I say in the paper, late pregnancy really is an example of 2 people. And, those original creatures are rotund, just like a woman in late pregnancy.
Yes.
And then, the infant comes out, is pushed out and cut. So this symposium story, which is always, as far as I can tell, I mean, I just have looked and looked, so maybe I haven't looked hard enough. Maybe there's somebody else out there who's talked about it in the way I do, but I can't find it. Is a kind of suppression of the maternal reality of real birth. And of course, Plato was obsessed with intellectual birth, the birth of ideas, and the superiority of that the philosopher is superior to actually, giving birth to a real person.
Yes. I mean, it's fascinating, that idea. And one wonders, did he know, was there this unconscious remembering?
Yeah, well, that's part of, right, the Platonic thing, is that that the past is then it's a form of going backwards in Plato, right? Which Kierkegaard picks up on. And Kierkegaard is constantly, I didn't mention him in the essay, but Kierkegaard is obsessed with birth and pregnancy metaphors, which he never actually relates either to real birth.
So Estella Weldon, who I see is somewhere in this call, she writes about, Freud obviously talked about penis envy and this idea that all little girls really want to have penises and are so overwhelmed with this desire. And she talks about kind of womb envy, actually.
Yes.
That there is a real, and I'm just interested.
There is a tradition of womb envy in psychoanalysis. Of course, women analysts are the ones who came up with the idea, not men. Well, no, I think, Freud, he couldn't look at female genitalia as full, right, as present. It was for him a form of absence, which is perspectival, right? It's the little boy, the idea of lack. I mean, I don't know if anyone cares. Jacques Lacan also went in that direction, right? That it's a lack, it's an absence, it's what's not there. Well, there's a lot there. And how can you forget that what comes out of the, you know, the birth canal, the vaginal canal, is a human being, you know, for women who are mothers or become mothers. So the suppression of this fascinates me.
Mm. No, me too. I think it's extraordinary. And I think the other really compelling aspect of what you're talking about is this idea of an attack on the dyad, this idea of being so uncomfortable. There's such a discomfort with this idea of the in between, the mix, the borders. And I guess I was thinking a lot about how that relates to artistic creation
Yeah.
and talk about that.
Yeah, this is, you know, I think over the years I've felt more and more the kinship between, you know, psychoanalysis as a discipline and 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 creating art, right? So the difference, the important difference, and I've written about this elsewhere, is of course in psychoanalysis you're with a real other. And that's very important, you know, that there's an actual living, breathing human being who is part of the dialogue. In art, you know, I was thinking it's a reaching toward an imaginary other,
That's
right?
so beautifully.
The other isn't, you know, yes, I think sometimes in the creative act, there is a kind of real other in mind. I mean, that it is constituted by relationality, which is always part of our memory. But the real analyst can, uh, you know, push back. That's the story of analysis, which is why it's good, you know, is that there's someone there to kind of stop you at times. But that between space, and this is why I like Dewey, John Dewey, who I mentioned. His book, Art as Experience, is really a beautiful book. And there he talks about the arc of experience in a very dynamic way that becomes the object, the art object. I think he's absolutely right about this. It's an embodied act, and it has a confined temporal reality, you know, and he understands that as an organic reality of what he calls the alive creature.
That's so
And
beautiful. And
it's
it's
beautiful. I mean, you know, some of these pragmatists are really good. And it cuts against the idea of art making. I have to say, Winnicott is also can be put into that camp. The idea of art making as some, you know, esoteric, intellectual experience that is limited to the few people in the world who we call artists, right? That art making, these forms of creativity are necessary for living well. And you know, when Winnicott says, some people, you know, have forgotten or were never learned how to play,
yeah.
and they have to be brought back into that space, that between potential space of creativity and culture. I find this very moving um and true. You know, I think, I don't know if I'm making this up or if he actually says it, but it's like he says something like, you know, making a pie you know, is a creative act
Yeah.
too, that it's part of what we do as human beings. And and Dewey says the same thing. It shouldn't be isolated. And Langer, you know, talks about art as symbolic of human feeling. And she was very interested in, you know, what has been called homeostatic reality, or, what the body does, not to return to some static reality, but to adjust to the environment, a continual dynamic adjustment that is part of being alive as an organism. I mean, this goes way down, right? I mean, a single bacterium will steer its way, will move away from a toxin and towards, say, sucrose or some delicious thing. That is part of the agency of even single-celled creatures, not to speak of the cells, in our bodies. What the heck is that? Very
And
few biologists want to talk about this, right? The agency of a single cell.
And when you started, of course, linking something about agency and volition, you were talking, and I'm pleased that there are so many artists and art psychotherapists here. You were talking about Winnicott's notion of the importance of play, and one of my favorite questions that Winnicott asks about a child's health is, but can he play?
Yeah.
And that's, really, really beautiful. And that's something about this freedom and this, something you need, that transitional space, that me and not me. And I guess the experience of art making can relate to that. And what you've brought to life in this paper so incredibly subtly and powerfully, actually, is that link with what has happened in what you've called the actual third of the placenta.
Yeah,
This is
it's a literal third, right? So I think it opens up, again, there's nothing final about this. And I try to make that clear in the last paragraph. It's a way to open up discussions about the between. And here we have a literal between organ, that dies after it's served its purpose during pregnancy. And we have a kind of biological organ that is rich with philosophical possibilities that should be explored rather than ignored. And one of the reasons I brought in Judith Scott, if you've read the paper, Judith Scott had a show at the Brooklyn Museum, and the year is in the paper. I can't remember what year I saw it.
2014. Yeah, you signed it.
And, I walked through that show. I was absolutely, gobsmacked, as they say. And I imagined that this was the work of some, kind of, to be honest, intellectual artist who had looked at a lot of Louise Bourgeois, perhaps, but had made her own way. It turns out that Judith Scott was a twin with Down syndrome. Her sibling did not have Down syndrome, and she never learned to speak or sign. She started making art in her 40s, and she did it with string and cord and ribbon, and she wrapped up objects. There was almost always a core. And these works are just the most moving and I think brilliant, art objects. She loved them.
Mm.
But, she wasn't a person who then was really interested so much in the reception, although the reception turns out to be, one of a lot of acclaim. She died. And she was rescued. She was sent away because she was deaf, and they thought she was profoundly retarded, which of course she wasn't. But then she was neglected and at times abused in institutions, and didn't get out of them until her twin came to her rescue. And so there's a lot of trauma in the work. But I think the reason that Judith Scott, became the image here is that in that way, she's not a sophisticated artist who studied the history of Western art, right? This was not part of her possibility. So it reinforces the embodied aspects of art making. Working, right, when you work, when you write, or in my case, write, you realize, how much of what's happening is really not conscious, right? That these images present themselves and you say, that's right, even when they feel mysterious, or you can't explicate why this thing is right. And just watching this piece, I mean, there's a real emotional arc of being chained, being confined, and the finding a kind of freedom. I mean, that last transformation into a being with sneakers, I think, right? It's wonderful. You participate in the arc of what's happening. I mean, when those eyes close, I felt, of course, this is the most horrible thing in a way, right? To be cut dead by others, to not be seen.
I asked her about her mother's eyes, just apropos, and she said they were gold like a wolf.
Whoa.
She could never look at her mother in the eye because that would lead to an attack. But I don't. So she's also covered in self-harm scars, which she has said are unshed tears, though there's something there. So, Kate, I see you've put your camera on and you're going to speak. Let's hear who would like to speak, Kate, and then Vicky.
I have nothing profound to say other than I found the video very moving.
Oh.
Excuse me. And I'm afraid I didn't catch the first part of your conversation, but given that I work with very tiny babies and mothers, and it just made me wonder what Shaz has been through herself from her very early infancy. And the association I had actually was from visiting a NICU the other day, which was all these babies wired up and, being kept alive on tubes, and all the eyes, coming in and seeing these babies. And there was something the psychotherapist said was, I asked whether they could touch the babies. And she said, well, we have to be very careful. You can put your hand on them, but you can't rub their skin. But, you can't just do even softly, because their skin is just too fragile. And, they have babies in there from sort of 20, that have been born at 26 weeks gestation. And it may not be even relevant. It was just the association I made around skin and the eyes and the looking, and what, when you were talking about the umbilical cord, which is so vital, and Scott's work as well, that this being the life force, and when it's taken away and it's put in artificially, what does that do to somebody's growth and internal state of mind, and how they come into the world. Amazing.
Tell me about where you're working with tiny babies and mothers. Kate was working in secure units like me for a long time.
I was there for about 30 years, wasn't I? And then I jumped ship, and I'm now working as a perinatal psychoanalyst in Bedford. And we're now sort of linking up with Luton and Dunstable NICU, which I think is one of the leading services now in the country, Gosh, really at the forefront of working with these tiny babies. But we'll work with mothers who are sort of in their second trimester and supporting them with bonding, and the idea of the phantom umbilical cord and just the idea of what the fantasies are. And my doctorate was based on using psychometric studies and semi-structured interviews with mothers to how they imagine the baby in their minds and who that baby is. And it just resonates so much with the work in forensics as to sort of how were they held in mind as an infant or even in utero, that whole in utero experience. Yeah.
And in your former life, you were an art psychotherapist. So
that's right. Yeah. So
you're retaining some of the notion of imagery and
very powerful. Yeah. And and the work that Tony does is to sort of manifest these extraordinary internal images. And
I mean, it makes me think of this as another thing. I did a kind of in-depth interview about art therapy, and I found a story of a man who had been a soldier and had witnessed an explosion and the death of a comrade, who had God, what is it called? They know about this now. Football players get it too. It's a TIA. It's like a form of concussion, but he also was completely traumatized, had PTSD. And he talked about this face in the bunker, and his art therapist had him make the face, which was a real abstract, not a kind of literal image of a face, but it was nevertheless a face. And they went through this whole process. And at one point, his flashbacks were diminishing as he worked on this face. And then he made a box for it that he decorated very carefully, spent a lot of time, and they then put the box on a shelf in the art therapy room, and his symptoms diminished to nothing. And when I was reading this, I thought about all the symbolic activities in shamanistic rituals, which are clearly, drawing this kind of thing. It was, an act of burial of this face in the bunker dying and being put away with respect and care. And it really made a powerful impression on me, because again, you can see what the symbolic gestures are, but they're deeply embodied through the art.
Absolutely. Vicky, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. I'm at work and can't turn on the camera, but I appreciate the conversation I was able to listen to and share with you that I'm a radiologist who does obstetric imaging. So I'm part of taking ultrasound images, and I'm particularly interested in the cord and the placenta. So this topic really resonated. And I just wanted to share, referencing the first part of your conversation, there's a beautiful passage I use when I teach about placenta that comes from Anne Fadiman's book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And in it, she describes that in the Hmong language, the word for placenta is translated as jacket, and it refers to our first and finest garment. And there are special rituals that are observed about how the placenta is handled and where it is buried and how it connects to our soul and our life's journey. And it's at the beginning of the book, and it's, I think, really relevant to your conversation.
Absolutely.
Can you say the name of that book again, please, Vicky?
Sure. The author is Anne Fadiman, I can put in the chat, and the title of the book is The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which is sort of the Hmong explanation. It's a Western medicine meets a Hmong family, and their child has a seizure disorder.
Mm.
And it tells in really beautiful ways the two versions of an understanding of that. And so the title refers to an explanation for a seizure.
Yeah,
Absolutely fascinating, isn't it?
it is.
And I imagine in your work, you're seeing so much that's, you're seeing these images, but you're also seeing the actual woman in whom these images,
Right, right. Because when doing an ultrasound, there's touch involved, we're looking inside with sort of a magical wand. Yeah. One patient, an artist, referred to it as listening to the future.
Oh, that's lovely.
That is. And whereabouts is that, if you're allowed to say?
Oh, I'm in San Francisco.
Gosh, and is there a lot, are other people interested in the way that you are? Are you quite unique?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm finding the more I talk about incorporating art and art thinking into medicine, I realize how many people it's part of who they are. It's just not often manifest in the work environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I have a seminar. I'm a sort of marginal figure in the psychiatry department at Weill Cornell, but I have a seminar with psychiatric residents where they write, and we and so I don't have an overview of the whole psychiatric climate there, and the students who come to me do not have to come to me, right? They're doctors who are interested in art, but they're really alive and fascinated by the artistic process and how it relates to psychiatric practice. So that's all I can speak to. But I agree with you, Vicki, that once you start talking to people about this, you don't run into a lot of hostility. Rather, people are quite open.
Yeah, I agree. I wish I sort of brought these conversations up sooner. I've had a little more time later in my career, but yeah, it's amazing what people have to share about. Now at medical meetings, we have slideshows of work people create, arts and crafts that they do, and it's amazingly revealing and really bonding. So I'm glad it's part of what I do now. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh, no, thank you for participating. I'd love to hear from others. I don't want to be like a school teacher. Here you are. Noreen. Hi, please speak.
Hi, everybody. I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I'm joining you this evening from Ireland. So thank you very much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed listening, and I had a lot of thoughts while I was listening. Maybe I'll just share a couple. One in relation to the video you very generously showed us, Anna. I suppose just some thoughts that I had as I was watching it. I mean, the first thing when the first eye appeared on the screen, I kept on thinking it was a wound, and I kept on thinking of I and I, as in the letter I for the subjective self, and then I was aware of the figure, the kind of the plasticine, or the figure that was, was hung up, I suppose. I kept on thinking of meat, and I felt this sense that I wanted to unhook the figure. And then the other thought that I had when the face appeared was I felt this relief, and I hadn't even realized that I hadn't noticed that the figure didn't have a face. I suppose that was my so I found it, and there was something about it was kind of the leaking of the tear from the eye initially. I think that was, for me, that was very powerful, because it was almost like, I think of something like Niagara Falls. It was a single tear, but it felt like an eruption. That's what it felt like. So that was in relation to the video. And then I was just thinking, I don't know if you've seen it, Siri, or if anybody has seen it, but I teach, I also teach in a university, and I teach young students. And as part of the course that I teach them, we do the transitional object.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've really noticed is how attached they are to their mobile phones, but it seems to be a very tactile attachment. It's very
Yeah.
difficult for them. Like, I tell them to put their phone in the bag, and it's very, very difficult for them to put it away because they like touching it and, seeing if it's still there. But there's something about feeling it and rubbing it and stroking it.
Yeah.
And when I was doing the transitional object, I kind of, we explore the phone in relation to that now and how that might be transferred from earlier life. But I actually found on the internet that there's an umbilical cord mobile phone charger. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a video, and it freaks them
No.
out completely. Like, it's really, I'll put it in the chat. I just looked at it there. I just looked it up as you were talking.
Okay.
I was thinking, but it's amazing to see it. I'll put it in the chat now. But thank you so
Okay.
much. There's just a couple of the thoughts I've been having as I've been listening to you both. So I'll share it there with everybody in the chat. It's well worth it. It's well worth the look later.
That's so amazing.
Can I say something about that? It just was,
Yeah.
I don't come from a psychoanalyst background, except that I've been in therapy most of my life. But I couldn't help thinking about how the placenta at this point, I've been involved in computers a lot, and it seems like we've gone beyond it. We're wireless now. We're not connected anymore. And so that kept drumming in my head the whole time. How do people accept something so tangible at this time when everything we do is wireless? And it was really in my head constantly about the whole thing. But also with the presentation, for some reason, the tearing was the most, it had the biggest effect on me. What effect, I don't know, but I loved the tearing and seeing the eyes and tearing through. So I don't know why that meant something to me, but it did. But I also love the image of the placenta too.
Yeah, well, the phone thing and then this wireless question. I mean, I think these are really open and interesting questions that I mean, I don't have the real answers to it, but of course, phones are a kind of vehicle to the other, right? I mean, if we're thinking of transitional objects, I know there's what's his name, the philosopher Chambers and somebody else, they did a thing about the extended self, right? This is actually Merleau-Ponty did it way back, in the olden days, but these are analytical philosophers, so they just ignore the whole history of phenomenology, of course. But yeah, that idea, but it's the phones particularly are toward the other. It's an interesting thing, right? Because the abstraction that Trudy was talking about is, of course, definitely there. And there's, huge alarm, of course, about social media, what this is doing, the as you say, wireless. Of course, the internet does have wires. We don't see them, but there's a whole infrastructure that is needed to support this phone world that we live in and internet world that we live in, that people have a tendency to forget about it. The cloud, right? The cloud is, but no, it's really also material, but we don't see it, and that affects everybody, I think.
So we have two hands, Kate and then Janet.
Mine was just a quick comment about the phone, in that, well, in the sort of Kleinian sense, the mobile phone seems to be quite a sort of schizoid object, and yet what we're thinking about is the importance of remaining connected, that desire, very strong pull for connection through through the internet, through the computer, through the phone. But just in my observations with the under 5s children I work with, we do have toy mobile phones, but we also have phones that are the old model with the receiver and the umbilical like coil
Yes, yes.
wire to the phone, and they always go for those. Like they need that representation of the
That's
mother and the child, rather than they sometimes will hold their hands to their ears and the hand is the phone, but it just doesn't have the same quality for them.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to keep that in my head. I like that story. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Janet?
Hi all, thank you so much. Nice to be joining you as well from Ireland, close to Dublin. And yeah, it's kind of it's the conversation's really kind of whet my appetite, and it's kind of it's pulling on at least two identities that I hold. One as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, but also as an artist and art maker. And it's interesting. I was thinking of the phone there, and it was reminding me of, I suppose I was thinking about Winnicott's transitional objects, in which apologies if you can hear sheep in the background, it's feeding back.
That's wonderful.
But I was thinking of the kind of transitional object in the way that it becomes imbued with so much more importance, that it's actually more important than the parent, because of course it symbolizes the capacity for the child to soothe in the absence of the parent. So it's more magical almost than the actual person. And I was thinking that the phone has that kind of effect, because I was thinking I work a lot with teenagers, and that sense of connection, and I think particularly in this kind of post-COVIDian world, you know, and where online life really was the only place in which people could meet safely, you know, and you know, I'm thinking about how the loss of a phone to a teenager at a time when developmentally that sense of connectedness and the need to be with others and friends and social group becoming more important than the family, that there's something about this kind of sense of being tethered or not to something that kind of holds that kind of degree of vitality for the life and the emerging life, I suppose, of the adolescent and the I suppose the adult to follow. But just out of curiosity, I tried to see if what the Gaelic word was for placenta, and interestingly, there isn't one. There is called brogos, which is afterbirth. So it doesn't speak of the living placenta, but the afterbirth. But actually, it translates as a dirty, scraggly thing. So it's referencing the use to the animal, but actually it's also used to describe a person who seen as being kind of disheveled and dirty. So it's so it kind of I was kind of curious about that, in the way that there at least there isn't we have words in the Irish language called bearlicus, which are words that are actually English words that are made translated in English, but actually their origin is English, because we wouldn't have had words that followed, if you know what I mean. But I thought that was really curious to think that something that perhaps couldn't be seen didn't have a name, you know. And I was thinking of the temporary organ that a placenta is, that it's something that forms about 4 weeks. My understanding is about 4 weeks into gestation, but then obviously is disposed of or you know, gotten rid of, I suppose, or expelled by the body following birth.
It is waste, right? I mean, it becomes waste. And that's probably the root of this. What's interesting is that in so many other traditions, the placenta is regarded as a twin of the, you know, of the infant, and revered in various cultures. I mean, it was mentioned here, the hmong, you know, that, so this is not unusual. I mean, and in some cultures it's dried and used for medicinal purposes, which you know, now Western medicine knows that, yes, indeed, the placenta has all sorts of properties that are used in, I don't know, from shampoo to, you know, other things. But yeah, it's not a seen thing, right? Before we had sonograms that we talked about here before, it wasn't seen. So it was then in a way, the invention of this magical object in various cultures that were buried in particular ways, you know, as a kind of spiritual presence for the infant, or, you know, it is strange. And they are, of course, placenta is an extremely strange looking thing. You know, it comes from cake. That's where the origin of the word is from a cake. And it's really weird looking. I don't remember mine. I got interested in the placenta after I gave birth, so I don't remember what it looked like. I think they just threw it away. There was no, you know, procedure or anything. They don't show it to you. I think maybe they should, you know.
I remember after giving birth to my daughter, a couple of days later, I was at home and this huge thing fell out of me, and it was some
Part
kind
of the placenta, right?
but it was like a horror movie, you know.
They're
This
really weird
blood
looking. They're
and
supposed to get everything, right? They're supposed to
it's
get the whole thing out.
And also I was remembering, I mean, we're, you know, just talking about kind of the strangeness of this incredible organ, which has been invisible, and its denigration when you talk about it being described in the Irish language as something dirty and broken, or that's how people are, not broken, but dirty and shabby, and that's the same word is used for that kind of person. The Nigella Lawson, I think, famously cooked up her placenta, and it was kind of titillating but horrifying urban myth about this, and it somehow had something of the grotesque about it, but it's actually, that is a very Western idea, isn't it, that this
It is,
thing.
although, you know, I did some research on this because, you know, I thought it was interesting because actually if you type in placenta, what comes up instantly, you can't just type in placenta on Google, because what comes up is, should you eat it?
Okay,
Now,
that's
so I, you know, then I kind of looked, I think there are, most of the cultures that I investigated there, it's dried first and then sometimes used for medicinal purposes. There are, other mammals eat their placentas routinely. Human beings in most cultures do not. And, you know, you have to think that the placenta is created from tissues of both maternal and embryonic tissue. So it is a form of cannibalism. You're, you know, eating your organ. It's not just out of in fact, it's interesting to look at the science, because you realize that there are people in embryology who just insist on the fact that it's only embryonic tissue. But when you really go into the research, it's both, right? So if you're ingesting your placenta, you're also eating a part of what was part of yourself. And
it must be magical, right? You must be, the wish must be that I can retain this magic thing that grew inside and produced this baby and will now nourish, aside from whatever the science is. There's a kind of,
yeah, it's a kind of new agey thing, I believe. Not so common in most human cultures.
So Janet, you've just found a better translation of placenta.
Oh, good. Okay.
You want to tell us? I have to confess, I have a secret love for the Irish. I do lots of supervision groups for the Irish Prison Service, And I swear there's something in the Irish genes that makes people naturally very good at poetry and psychoanalysis. And that isn't just a romanticization, it seems to be a truth.
Or what or that kind of fake whatever that was about the Irish not being analyzable according to Freud, which I don't think was ever said, but anyway, that's the story that gets told. Yeah, so it's just brogos, so the afterbirth of an animal or any scraggly thing. I kind of like that. So or ragged line of a sea wreck. Or Dadini means about a person, so lazy or listless person, a wretch, and weeds. So it's it brings those used in many ways.
And Anna Gatt, who's joined us, you're going to put your little camera on, Anna, so we can see your lovely face. No?
Sorry, I can't. I'm so sorry. I'm organizing a major festival for tomorrow, so just dropping by because it was killing me that I would miss out on listening to this. And I actually just had a conversation with Diana Fleischman, the evolutionary psychologist, about her eating her own placenta. She turned it into a smoothie. She explained this over lunch, which ended the lunch. But for her, it worked out really well, apparently. And I think she spoke about this publicly, so I'm not giving away any secrets here.
No secrets. No. Okay.
So I think it's not just New Age. I think it's coming back in like different kind of treadwife circles around the world. I think it's probably a cyclical thing when women are allowed to be fascinated by this organ and when we are not allowed.
It's interesting, we're all women in this salon, as far as I'm aware.
That's true. You mentioned birth and only women sign up. It's the free market. We didn't do anything.
Maggie, you're an anthropologist as well as an artist and an art educator. What have you come across in these studies that you've done in your own work about the placenta?
Well, I just want to say, separate from the placenta, that this whole idea of unease with in between states, and is sort of going back to the 17th century. I just kept thinking about, individualism being just so pernicious in everything, and all the fairly recent research on trees and the mycelium, trees are, everyone thought they're just competing for light and resources, and they're just these little individual growing things that are fighting to stay alive. And of course, all the research says they live in communities. There are mother ones, the ones that die, they nurture the ones who are there, and these incredible roots of mycelium that go for vast distances, and that, this webbing and interconnectedness is just a completely different paradigm of how we see everything. And that 17th century mechanism and the connection between the economic system and the scientific system is, really creepy.
No, I think that's so true.
And also I found really interesting is like all the research on fascia and the sort of the recognition. I was kind of nerding out for a while on listening to all kinds of people who are changing physical work with people, and that the all the anatomy drawings and the way we talk about this muscle and that muscle, the bicep and the tricep, when you actually rip the skin, when you remove the skin or look below, there are these like mixtures of, they're just webs of tissue that go from, the toes up the body and around to the top of the head. And there are these, this model of like trains, anatomy trains of flesh or whatever. And, it's just a completely different webbed, interconnected, not bounded, not discretely nameable with little charts. Reality that we've been bamboozled into,
Yeah, well, the whole idea of these discrete boundaries, which is I mean, we agree. This is why, you know, for example, there has never been agreement, you know, in anatomy about how many muscles, right? And in genomics, you know, why don't, you know, this is, you know, the sort of fantasy of the gene is like, you know, these little beads on a string, which has nothing to do with what the genome is, right? And that's why we don't say there's, you know, 22,310 genes, because genes can't be counted. There's no count, right? They're not discrete in that fantasy way that you know, that was promoted with the Human Genome Project, all this stuff. You know, they're not deterministic. It's this incredibly complex reality that is not fully understood by any means. And again, it's part of the same tradition that Maggie's talking about, right? That, you know, Hobbes, Descartes, out of this mechanistic understanding. And, you know, of someone I'm a great fan of, who is Alfred North Whitehead, who at the end of a beautiful book, actually the only book by Whitehead that I think, I wasn't going to say normal, not normal, but people can understand, who, you know, some of his other work is just so difficult, but he talks about a forest at the end, in Science in the Modern World, in which he says that basically 17th century science, you know, destroyed science. And then he goes on to talk about a forest as a community. So whenever this, what year was Science in the Modern World published? Well, it's quite a long time ago. It's before some of these biological facts had emerged.
I think there are always, I mean, just like you were talking about Dewey and artist experience, this was definitely against, there were people who felt and wrote about some other sense of reality that aligns with what we know now. But
yeah, absolutely. And all along, right? So, you know, when you really go back and start, you know, peeling away the layers, you see, I mean, one of my favorite people in the 17th century is Margaret Cavendish, a great natural philosopher, I think, and what she talked about was interdependence, absolute interdependence, and communication between parts of nature. I mean, you go back to her, it's as if, you know, you are just resurrecting discussions now in the philosophy of biology. I wrote a paper about her as the grandmother of, you know, contemporary problems in the philosophy of biology. So there you go. You find them. The problem is that they're kind of suppressed. I mean, Whitehead isn't exactly suppressed, but, you know, he's very difficult, and he's sort of living in his own world and not taken seriously in what we think of as mainstream science.
Right, and what parts of their ideas are taken up, and the rest they're just kind of hovering there, waiting.
Exactly. It's selective. It's selective resurrection, right? And so the sort of full body of the thought, including Cavendish, who has been resurrected, but very rarely in science, in philosophy and in literature, but scientists, you know, don't want to go there.
I'm just aware we've only got a couple more minutes. And is there anyone who would like to say something? Pauline or Melissa, who hasn't already spoken? Because you're so welcome to say whatever it is. I see you smiling there, Pauline. I feel like you might want to say something.
Yes.
No, I didn't actually, but I'm fascinated by the discussion, and I suppose the mechanistic view of the body I find that very interesting at the moment, because I just think it's amazing when we're supposed to have such psychological understandings of people, how really people are so symptom, diagnosis, treatment, and then frustration that obviously the things don't work, and keep on searching for the answer to get the thing that fixes. And as I suppose, as a doctor and a psychiatrist myself, and the sense that we are obliged as doctors to cure, that isn't just an expectation, but that it's your responsibility to find the answer and the right test and the treatment. So that was just this interesting that despite our advances in society, in a way, we've kind of gone back to a more simplistic way of thinking, which is rather strange.
Yeah.
And I suppose it kind of feeds into all those kind of discussions around things like even gender identification, all that stuff. Is because it's all based on A plus B must equal C, and it feeds into your comments about the genome, not being able to count the genes, and all these different systems. I'm kind of just amazed that this is complete buy-in to the idea that we are such mechanistic things, and that if you just find the right test or whatever, you will do it. So the other thing regarding the placenta was, and I was hoping you could send the link to the paper, if possible, afterwards.
Oh yeah, I can set that up. Yeah.
Thank you, that'd be great. Obviously, the first time I ever heard of placenta outside a medical context being mentioned was when I used to go to this Eastern European facialist in Australia, who used to insist on putting various animals' placentas on my face.
It's supposed to be really good.
to keep me young. So let's see how well that's working. So and this whole notion of in Chinese medicine, eating the placenta and, like, burying it and revering it and being a source of vitality. So I didn't see it as entirely new age. I thought, there is a long
I'm
history.
sure you're right. Yes,
Yeah,
I deflect that thing. I mean, because my research wasn't very deep. I mean, some of my research has been very deep, but not that on the whole placental, world. That I would really have to.
But possibly was excessively
go into.
revered. I mean, there are
Yes.
dangers as well in consuming it. Or I'm not saying it's something that I went out to do myself. And
Right.
I suppose the other point I thought that was interesting that you raised was, despite us knowing that we are formed by two people, we never seem to say, I am the product of two people, that I'm the product of obviously generations, but that we do seem to see ourselves as being very individual, arising de novo after the process. So I think that's quite interesting. So there's a lot of food for thought in lots of ways. Thank you. I'm enjoying the discussion.
Well, thank
Oh,
you.
I'm glad you talked. It was good.
Add one thing to this discussion about being part of two people.
That's
I remember when I was a teenager or something, my father was a big science fiction fan, and he told me just a little bit about a book where the people, or whatever they were called, had a big problem, and it was a sexual problem, because it didn't take two people to get together or two objects. It took 15. So life was very complicated on that planet.
That's kind of good.
So we've reached the end of our time. Does anyone have any burning comment or last word? And if not, I just want to say this has been absolutely a delight for me and such a pleasure to talk with Siri and with all of you. Absolutely loved it. So thank you so much. And yeah, so much to think about and take away and look up. And yes, I will definitely send Siri's paper to, or if I send it to Anna or Haley, they can send it to everyone because they'll have all your email addresses. But it's an absolutely beautiful paper, as you can glean, and there's so much more of Siri's work to read and think about, and so much more art to make. We didn't get to talk about healing as much as we might have. It's there in the paper, the kind of rhythms and connections from this. I mean, I've just come away thinking like a child, I can't believe the woman's body can interact with the baby and create this organ.
I know.
This. It's just fucking amazing, right?
I know it is. I agree.
That's fantastic. So yeah, I feel very, very enlightened and pleased to have had this time with you all. Thank you so much, Siri.
Well, and thank you. Thank all of you. It was really fun. I really had a good time. So wonderful. Thank you.